What's up guys, I'm Danica. Welcome back to my channel. It is Sunday, September 6th and it's around like midday. It's a little bit afternoon. And this morning I was so happy to wake up early and go to the gym. That's right, gyms are finally open again in Hong Kong after being shut down for 50 days in our third wave of COVID. They finally reopened on Friday and I was so excited. I've never been this excited for the gym to reopen because over the past 50 days when gyms were closed, they were closed for almost 7 weeks. I have just been feeling really crummy. Like it really disrupted my routine and I gained a bunch of weight. I think I gained like about 5 kilos, which was quite a lot to gain in 7 weeks. I really lost a lot of motivation. So I was so excited when my trainer texted me on Thursday and was like, gyms are open again tomorrow. And I was there right at 7 a.m. on Friday. I'm gonna insert my Friday early morning footage here. I look like a little bloated because 5:50 a.m. on a Friday. Good morning. It is 5:50 a.m. on a Friday and I'm awake because gyms are finally reopened again in Hong Kong. It has been so long. I think gyms closed on like July 15th or something and it is September 3rd today. So I never thought I would be this excited for my gym to reopen, but that's why I'm filming this. I feel like my routine has been so disrupted over the past 6 weeks. And I've actually gotten like a little depressed and I've gained a bunch of weight and I just, when my routine is thrown, I can't do anything correctly. So I'm about to head out. I'm gonna drink my morning water, but also I added some pre-workout. I really diluted in like a huge amount of water, which is important for me in the morning, but also probably not great because I always have to pee like 3 times during my training session. Okay, I'm gonna head out in a second and I will show you around my gym. Okay, so I'm heading into central Hong Kong and this is my walk every day. I walk past the HSBC building, which is like my favorite building in Hong Kong. But yeah, it's pretty light outside, which is nice. I have earphones in, so it's a bit weird. Fully covered up gym look. Anyway, fast forward to Sunday, today again, and I am at home. I went to the gym this morning just to get on the treadmill, and then I got a coffee and I came back. I'm sort of like starting to purge a bunch of stuff from this apartment because I don't want to move it to like a new place if I don't really need it anymore. And I found this sweatshirt, which I forgot about. Do you ever do that when you like find clothes you forget about? I found this sweatshirt. I love it so much. I bought it at the end of last year. It's my Lo sweatshirt, and Lo is my last name. I don't know if you can tell from far away, but it's embroidered with these flower things, but it's from this brand that I love, and the brand is called Lazy Oaf, and it's a brand out of the UK. I love it. The designer makes some really quirky, funny stuff, and I definitely have this quirky, weird side, so once in a while I'll go like ham on her website and I'll just buy a lot of things, and LO, Lazy Oaf, or my surname. Today I thought I would do a tag video. I have never actually done a tag video before in all the years that I've been sporadically and randomly posting to YouTube, but I saw one the other day called Growing Up Asian American, and I watched a whole bunch of them. I found them to be so interesting, and a lot of why I found it to be interesting is because most of the people who are on YouTube are younger than I am, and it was so interesting to watch videos about growing up Asian American done by people who grew up in a generation right after mine, but from all over the US. So people who grew up in California, who grew up on the East Coast, who grew up in New York, who grew up in the Midwest, who grew up in the South. I I loved it, and I thought I would do my own. One thing I've been thinking about so much over the past 18 months of living in Hong Kong is something that you hear all the time as a person who does not look conventionally mainstream American when you're growing up in America. And by that I mean, if you are non-white and growing up in the United States, especially in the time that I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, you would hear a lot of people, and I'm sure you guys have like heard this or like have seen this in media, but it's the idea of go back to where you came from. And over the past year and a half, I've been thinking what's been really interesting about my integration as an expat in Hong Kong is that I've sort of gone back where I sort of came from. My family is not from Hong Kong. My family is from Taiwan. And in the US, I guess, when people who are rude and like racist say to you, go back where you came from, they just sort of generically mean go back to Asia when they say it to people of Asian descent. What's been really interesting about being back in Asia as an adult and as a working professional, someone of Asian descent who I had never lived in Asia before this. I was born in England and I grew up in New York. But integrating here has been really eye-opening. First of all, being in Hong Kong as somebody who doesn't speak Cantonese, I grew up speaking Mandarin and English, it's been really hard to integrate. However, I do in a weird way feel that I have had an easier time integrating in Hong Kong versus my white American friends who also moved here but who don't just like blend in. I feel kind of lucky that I can sort of just blend in Hong Kong. So in a way, what that allows me to do is I spend a lot of my weekends just wandering around the city. I like to take the subway, which is called the MTR here. I will take the subway basically anywhere, and I will get out of the subway and then just sort of walk around neighborhoods. And I definitely have like things where I dress slightly different than people who are from Hong Kong. And I'm like a bigger person. I'm like 5'6", and I'm like a bigger girl, and so like I definitely don't look like a local, but it's not immediately obvious that I am not local. Also, my last name is Lowe, which when I was growing up in New York, there was no one. I didn't know anybody with the surname Lowe. But here, Lowe is sort of like the Smith of Hong Kong. Like every other person's surname is Lowe. So in a way, I do feel very lucky that I've been able to blend in here. Thinking about that has really made me think a lot about, I mean, I guess in retrospect, though I'm still really close to it, and so I don't have complete perspective on it yet, but the idea of how I felt growing up in New York and being an American person of Asian descent, and in the United States, being an Asian American makes me a minority. Anyway, that's why I really wanted to do this tag video. I've been thinking about my identity a lot over the past year and a half in terms of being Asian, being American, what that means, and where I see myself going in the next 5, 10, 15 years. So without further ado, here is my video about growing up Asian American. The first question on the growing up Asian American video tag list is, which ethnicity are you? Like I mentioned before, my family is from Taiwan. My mother's mother, so my grandmother, left mainland China in the 1940s, and my mother was born in Taiwan. My dad's family has been in Taiwan for many generations, and my dad's father, my grandfather on my paternal side, identifies as Hakka ethnicity. Question number 2, which generation are you? So even though I sound entirely American and I spent almost my entire life in the United States, I was born in England, and I lived in England till I was just about 5 years old before my parents and I emigrated to New York, and my brother and sister were born in New York City. I don't know if that technically makes me 0 generation or 1st generation, but I suppose I am an immigrant, although I immigrated when I was a child. The third question in the Growing Up Asian American tag is, What is the first experience where you felt that demarcation of being a minority / different? I think about this all the time, and I thought about it a lot more in recent years because I've been talking to my brother a lot about he has little kids now, and for a while they were thinking about moving to the suburbs or moving out of New York City. And one of the things that I really do believe that I felt so lucky to have, and I think my brother and my sister probably both feel this way too because my brother has decided to stay in New York City with his kids, is that growing up in New York City, everyone around you is different. I grew up in Queens, New York. I grew up living in Flushing. I went to elementary school and junior high school in Bayside, Queens, and I went to public school. And I didn't really know that white people were the predominant race in the United States probably until I got to college. Like, I sort of knew because it was part of pop culture, right? When you watch television, you would see mostly white people. Although like The Cosby Show and like In Living Color were two of the most popular shows in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up. So I don't think I was as aware of a mainstream culture as I probably would have been if I was Asian American and growing up in the Midwest, say, or in a suburb or somewhere that wasn't New York City. I grew up in an incredibly diverse community, and in my class at school, we were tracked in elementary school, so you were with the same 30 kids, like from first grade until sixth grade, and some to even beyond until like eighth grade. I even went to high school with like a bunch of people I started in first and second grade with, but there was no sense of being different until fourth grade. And I remember this, and I didn't even realize at the time that this was about my race. But in fourth grade, there was a new girl who joined our class who joined the track that we were all in. We were in like a program from first grade to sixth grade in our public school in Queens. And there was a new girl who tracked into the program, and I guess she had moved from a different place or something, and she became friends with one of my really good friends at the time, and we're in fourth grade. I don't know how old are we, like 9 or 10 years old. But I remember like this is all very vague, but I remember, it's a long time ago, but I remember that she didn't want my friend to be friends with me anymore. Like, she wanted to be my friend's best friend, and she didn't want her to be anyway, you know, like 10-year-old drama. And that was back in the day when there was a lot of like note passing in class. And I remember seeing this note that this girl wrote to my friend, and she wrote to her that my friend should not be friends with me anymore because I was a smelly Chinese person. I guess at the time I didn't realize that this was racism or prejudice. I was like 10. And it really wasn't until pretty recently that I realized, like, this is like, 30 years later, like, I'm realizing that this is something that girl learned at home, that her parents said to her, and that she then put in writing and said about me to my friend. And it's not a big deal. I guess it is a big deal, but it's not a big deal because we were kids, and like, kids don't really know better. They're just reiterating what they heard their parents say. But I didn't feel that bad about it. I think my biggest question was like, wait, do I smell? And of course I didn't smell. I was like a 9-year-old kid, you know? And I guess I didn't realize the dynamics of race at that time because we were all so different. Like, I was in this class of 30 people, of like kids, and we'd been in the same class since we were all like 5 or 6 years old, but everyone was so different. Everyone was a different color. Everyone came from a different background. We had tons of immigrant kids in the class. Everyone was kind of like weird in their own way. right? Like, I think, well, we had like Asian kids, we had Black kids, we had Latino kids, we had Jewish kids, there were Irish and Italians and Greeks. Like, we had all different kinds of kids in this class. And I feel so lucky to have grown up in Queens, New York City in the 1980s. And yeah, I never felt different until that moment. Question 4 is, were you always proud of your heritage, or was there a time you rejected it? I don't think there was a time that I rejected my heritage. Like I said, I grew up in a very, very diverse community, and I went to a very, very diverse school, and I was in very diverse classes. That happened all the way through until 8th grade. And then actually in high school, I went to a high school in New York City that at the time that I went there was more than 50% Asian. And that, I mean, I didn't even feel different there because Asian Americans were the majority there. So I never felt that pressure to conform to anything else. I also grew up in the 90s. Well, by the time I was in high school, it was the 90s, and it was before social media. It was before the internet, right? The internet didn't really become a mainstream thing you could have in your house until the mid-90s. So there was no real pressure to look a certain way or be a certain way. I look back now even on like the 90s stuff, and I listen to 90s music and I watch 90s TV shows, and just the amount of creativity, or the level of like outside of the boxness you could be in the 90s was kind of amazing. Like, Sassy magazine was considered like the slightly left of center publication to read, but everyone was reading like 17 and like Teen Magazine and YM. It was just a very different time to grow up, where I feel very lucky, where we didn't have to conform to a lot of global or like universal or mainstream media images or culture in the way that I feel like, or that we're hearing and reading about how teens and people in their 20s feel like they need to now. Question number 5. What are some stereotypes that you struggle with? It's interesting to watch a lot of these videos and see what people have answered. I feel like I am in a different phase of my life than a lot of the YouTubers who have done this video. So I'm like middle-aged. For all intents and purposes, I'm middle-aged. And I feel like there have been a lot of social things that have come up over the course of my life that have been related to my race, but not explicitly, overtly enforced on me because of my race, if that makes any sense. But always in retrospect, I'm like, oh, they wouldn't have said that to somebody if they weren't Asian. I think one of the biggest things I have had to deal with, and I think it is related to being Asian American, is behavior of my bosses in the workplace. I had a boss years ago, and it was one of my very first jobs, and he used to call me things like an anime character and stuff like that, and I think that that was weird, and I wasn't comfortable with it, and obviously he wouldn't have done it to somebody who is not Asian American. But it was also like almost 20 years ago, where there was less of blowback. There was less blowback for your boss being like slightly inappropriate at work, but not necessarily doing something illegal. Does that make any sense? So things like that. I think I am treated differently in the workplace. I think one of the things that I have struggled with a lot over the past few years is the sense that I'm not always invested with the same amount of authority as other people who would be in my seniority positions at companies. So for example, I have been a director at several different publications, but I have also simultaneously been told that I do not possess the correct knowledge about a field that I do, but I believe it is tied to my ethnicity. For example, I worked at a food publication where I had a boss who would consistently tell me to my face and sometimes yell it to my face that I didn't know anything about food. However, I was tasked about writing about Chinese food and food from Asian cultures, and I would always be sent stories about food from Asian cultures that were written by somebody else to like edit or to fact check. I guess the people who were in charge thought that even though I was director, I couldn't possibly know about anything unless it was Asian. And that is something that I've had to deal with in a bunch of different jobs over the past 10 years, is my authority is questioned because I think that I'm othered. I think that people look at me and they're like, oh, she's different than us. She must not have the same knowledge that we do, even though I grew up in the US and I'm for all intents and purposes American by culture. Question number 6 is, can you speak your language? My language is English. It's American English. I actually learned English in England, and so once in a while, I do think this is like a relic of just being a child, and like the first time I spoke English and learned it, it was with a British accent. So when I moved to the US when I was a little kid, I was like this little Asian kid in New York with a British accent. I lost it pretty quickly because when you're a kid, you assimilate really, really quickly. But I do still tend to draw out my vowels a little bit, and I didn't notice this until college. I was a linguistics major in college, so I would notice things that I did, and I would notice, sounds and things that other people did, and I noticed them in myself as well. So a lot of people actually think that I'm from Southern California, because in Southern California, people also draw out their vowels a little bit, and also there are so many Asian people in Southern California. But if the question is about, do I speak the language of my heritage, I do speak Mandarin. I do not speak Taiwanese. I would love to learn Hokkien, Taiwanese Hokkien. It is also the Hokkien that they speak in Singapore and Malaysia, and it's very, very close to a dialect they speak in southern China. So I would love to learn it. It is not something that is easy to find a course about because it is dialectical and not a major language. I do think it's so important. I love the way it sounds, and it feels like an in-group language. If you know about sociolinguistics, there's in-group language and dialects, and there's like out-group. So there's like a more formalized version of language, and in a lot of societies in Asia there is a sort of like a national language. So Mandarin is the language that is taught in all the schools, but conversationally you can sort of like get along with people in local dialect, and I really want to learn Taiwanese Hokkien. I downloaded a bunch of apps that have like Hokkien. You can like learn phrases and words, and I've been sort of like listening to that, and it really reminds me of growing up in Queens in a Taiwanese community, and going to like church with Taiwanese people, and that sense of nostalgia for me is so tied to the sound of the language. Question number 7. How has being Asian American affected your relationship with your parents? When I think about my relationship with my parents, this is one of the reasons why it was so beneficial for me to grow up in Queens, New York, around a lot of other Asian people, and then go to high school with a lot of people of Asian descent. Because when we talk about the problems we had with our parents, they may not be the problems that are represented in traditional mainstream media. For example, when we were growing up, one of the biggest shows on TV was My So-Called Life, which only ran for I think 1 season, but was one of the best TV shows about teen and angst in the 90s like ever made. And shows like that, and then movies like The Breakfast Club and 16 Candles or things like that, they were fun to watch growing up, but I didn't really identify with that parent-child dynamic. And when I talked to my friends about the struggles that they had, these like generational parent-child struggles growing up, I do feel like there is a particular first-generation Asian parent-child struggle that happens in the United States or in any immigrant first-generation community. So I don't think I had any particular issues revolving around being Asian American that I struggled with my parents. And now as my generation starts to speak up, like I feel like I don't know if you guys feel like this, but I'm in Generation X, and I do feel like podcasts are so dominated by Gen Xers, people who are my age, like in their 40s and 50s. So the more that I listen to podcasts, for example, like Dave Chang's podcast, where he talks about his relationship with his father who recently passed, I feel like there's so many things that are going to start coming out now as my generation feels more and more comfortable speaking publicly about their relationship with their parents. Question number 8. How do you feel about your heritage now? I think this is where I started this video with when I moved to Asia a year and a half ago, I didn't really think of it as coming back to Asia and like looking for my roots. I do feel a very strong connection with Chinese speaking Asia. I spent a lot of time going back and forth between New York and mainland China over the past 2 years in my work, just from, working in media and working in food. I find I love it so much. I love coming to Asia, specifically the Chinese speaking part of Asia, so the north part of Asia. I love going to Taiwan. I feel like when I'm there, something just feels like it's like I'm part of it somehow. You know how when you go somewhere, and I think I've said this before, I feel a strong sense of memory tied to just senses. For me, a lot of it is smell, but it's not like literal smell. When I land somewhere and it feels correct, I think to myself, this smells right. This place smells right. And I feel that way about very few places in the world, but I do feel like that about Taiwan, and I do feel like that about Oxford in England. The last question in the Asian American tag is, what is your favorite thing about being Asian American? I don't know if I have an answer for this question because I've never not been Asian American, so I don't know what special things there are about being me because I've always been me. But what I really do like about being of Asian descent is this ability that I've had over the past year and a half to live in Asia and to be in Asia and to have something sort of in common with the new communities that I found here. I'm not sure if I have actually had an easier time integrating, but I do think that there's something about being here and looking Asian that has helped me like pass as Asian. And I really like that because that's allowed me to explore places and to go places where I don't stick out and I can just sort of like wander around anonymously. That is one of my favorite things. I was saying to my friends last night, I went to my friend's house for dinner the other night, and they have all moved to Hong Kong, and they're all American, but they're all white. And I just said, like, one of my favorite things to do, and this had nothing to do with being in Hong Kong, but just in general, one of my favorite things to do is I love traveling alone, and I love wandering around and just observing things, anything, people, restaurants, shopping behavior, looking at buildings, just being in places anonymously and blending in is one of my favorite things. And I don't know if that comes from also being a New Yorker. One of my favorite things about New York is that it's completely anonymous. Like, I've lived in the same neighborhood in New York City for, God, like 15 years. I've lived in the same block in New York City for 15 years, but still I go to the coffee shop and they will never call me by name because that is what we do in New York. We acknowledge that we exist, but it doesn't get too personal. And I really enjoy that. So honestly, that's not a great reason to be like, I love being Asian American because I get to blend in and no one, will pick me out of no one will point to me and say, you don't belong here, when I'm an interloper in this community and I'm just here exploring. But that is, I really enjoy that. Anyway, that is my version of the Asian American tag video. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already. On my channel, I make videos about writing. You can check out my How to Optimize Your Stories for SEO video that I posted a couple of weeks back. I also make videos just about life in general and like non-deep thoughts that I have all the time, just about stuff. Things that I've been thinking about, things that I've been trying to improve about myself. And I'm thinking about doing some fitness videos going forward, but we will see. I'm definitely scheduled to do an update video sometime in the next few weeks on my weight loss, so I will work towards that. Anyway, I hope you're having a great weekend, and I will see you next time.